So the new order of settlement for 14,000 political prisoners on Buru Island, lasting from 1969 to 79, has received renewed attention from scholars of history since 1998. And just so you can see where Buru Island is, this is kind of a map situating it. So in outpouring of historical scholarship and publication of political prisoners' memoirs has rightly drawn attention to the injustices suffered by the prisoners on the island. Few historical investigations, however, have considered indigenous Burunese experiences during this period, let alone those of indigenous women, often relegated to the background or portrayed monolithically as a type, such as noble savage, violent native, or ignorant islander, to name a few. I have challenged this narrative by considering the Buru Island penal settlement as a project of colonization. Thus, the new order simultaneously sought to discipline and suppress political opponents, while using them as a vehicle for transforming the physical and cultural landscape of the island in order to integrate it into a Java-centric state. Interactions between indigenous women and political prisoners constituted a key vector through which national hegemony was established. And this is just kind of trying to diagram and show all these different dynamics of colonization. It's by no means comprehensive, but just a tool to kind of visualize what's going on. Anyway, the new order's colonization of Buru operated via two overarching processes: imposition and hegemony. The first process, imposition, entails the direct settlement and transformation of the physical environment. The political prisoners, forced to become self-sufficient in rice production or perish, transformed riverine wetlands and dense forests that had once been a source of forest products, especially sago, which is the staple food source for people on Buru. As political prisoners found themselves falling behind quotas, especially due to corruption among military personnel that oversaw them, they were forced to look elsewhere for sustenance, and often harvested sago outside of the prison camp, which, though naturally occurring in the forest, was carefully regulated and taxed by the head of each indigenous clan. Many Burunese then decided it was better to harvest the sago and sell it for cash, rather than risk having the organizing principle of their economy be poached away. These physical changes in the landscape and environment transformed Buru's economy from one centered on clans as the primary unit of organization and sago as the basic commodity to a monetized national economy centered in Jakarta. While the imposition of new patterns of land use and monetization can account for the economic integration of indigenous Burunese communities into an Indonesian nation, they do not explain why Burunese also began to adopt normative national cultural forms relating to language, dress, religion, pastimes, and even sexuality. To explain this, I turn to hegemony. While colonization through imposition was driven largely by government notions of development, cultural hegemony occurred mostly in the domain of autonomous interactions between political prisoners and indigenous persons. But these interactions were also circumscribed by political prisoners' internalized notions of civilization, in quotes. I argue that sexual relations between prisoners and Burunese women constituted the key route through which the hegemony of Indonesian national culture was established on the island. The political prisoners and military personnel who came to Buru from Java found Burunese communities in almost every way opposed to their criteria of civilization. Shamanistic religious beliefs and practices, semi-nomadic lifestyle and Swidden agriculture, no written tradition, different standards of hygiene, and the prevalence of diseases such as leprosy, little material wealth, tree bark clothing, and more open notions of sexuality. Political prisoners, however, also began to worry prison officials and administrators as homosexual relationships developed among them. The psychologist on Buru's in-rehab team, which was concerned with prisoners as they called it mental development, maybe we could better call it indoctrination, viewed homosexuality severely as a psychological contagion. Homosexual relationships were not uncommon among prisoners, one usually older assuming a masculine role and another usually younger, in their late teens assuming the feminine role as a tanda. Theater, as depicted here, was a form of recreation sanctioned by the administrators, and sandiwara performances often became an arena where tanda could perform publicly their gender identity by acting in female roles. Some prison officials decided that homosexuality could be reduced by providing an alternative heteronormative sexual outlet, as well as the public health problem that was developing, which was a breakout of syphilis, which was spreading quickly throughout prison units and indigenous communities. So a plan was hatched to bring a number of Jakarta sex workers to the island. And this is strange because prostitution is at this time illegal in Indonesia. The plan advanced as Buru and Jakarta exchanged radiograms. When the plan reached a stage of maturity, the chief commandant of the camp announced it at the prisoners' morning roll call. However, Dr. Pranoa, one of the ulamas, raised serious moral objections, instead insisting on bringing family members to Buru. The first families arrived on Buru and settled at Unit 4, Savannah Jaya in 1972, where prisoners enjoyed more living space in single-family homes, family garden plots for personal consumption, and reduced work requirements. While the sex worker scheme sought only to reinforce heterosexual norms, the winning proposal further stipulated that heterosexual desires conform to models of bourgeois domesticity, rendering them more legible to the state. Modern legal regimes, after all, levy taxes, provide social services, and recognize inheritance, debt, parenthood, and ownership vis-a-vis the nuclear family as a legal unit. Few families came, however, as prisoners quickly found out that it came with a catch, that you had to sign a contract saying that you would stay on the island for life, and many were certain that they would one day be released. As the members of indigenous communities and political prisoners began to interact more frequently, starting with chance encounters in the jungle, heterosexual encounters and relationships developed between the two communities. Although interactions between political prisoners and indigenous communities were technically forbidden by the prison administration until 1975, officials generally turned a blind eye as they believed prisoners could act as a positive, quote-quote, civilizing influence, while relationships with local women would provide an alternative to homosexuality. Occasionally, these relationships led to marriage, an outcome especially encouraged by prison officials, also requiring prisoners to stay on the island for life. Most relationships between political prisoners and indigenous Burunese women, however, did not lead to marriage. First of all, because most indigenous women involved in these relationships were already married. Second, because many Javanese political prisoners interpreted their sexual relations according to a Java-centric discourse of civilization, which this outlines, some of the characteristics that, according to this discourse, might be associated with being civilized, and measuring how political prisoners perceived in their memoirs the Burunese community as being uncivilized. So, anyways, interpreting their sexual relations according to Java-centric discourses of civilization, political prisoners saw the eminence of extra and premarital sexual relations of indigenous women as either an indicator of primitiveness or a form of prostitution based upon less developed conceptions of marriage, whereby women were men's absolute property. Both of these perceptions, circumscribed by a discourse of what it meant to be civilized, allowed many political prisoners to easily sexually objectify the indigenous women, emotionally detaching themselves by either seeing themselves as indulging indigenous women's natural promiscuity or as a simple commercial transaction of prostitution. Both cases represent a misunderstanding of sexuality in Burunese society, in which extra and premarital sexual interactions were neither embraced nor completely taboo, but merely tolerated. Sexual interactions outside of marriage, should they be discovered, incurred a fine paid in kind called the harta to the clan by the male transgressor, its value determined by the head of a clan based on the nature of the sexual transgression, the woman's status, beauty, and ability to work. The harta, then, was misinterpreted by many political prisoners as a form of prostitution. An unpaid harta would escalate to physical violence, leading to the death of a number of political prisoners from 1969 to 79. Married women could also be punished, sometimes corporally through beatings, but much more often through public humiliation, most commonly being forced to wear a giant wooden penis around their waist for a few months. Thus, it was in women's interest as much as political prisoners to keep their affairs under wraps. Premarital sex was a lesser transgression than extramarital sex, requiring a lower harta, and the lack of any sort of punishment for the woman. While the harta system was indeed a way by which male members of a clan dominated women, it did not constitute the same property relationship that a number of prisoners ascribed it. Union commandants were often called upon to settle a dispute over a harta involving a political prisoner, but as the commandant shared the prisoner's Javanese understanding of sexuality, they often misunderstood the harta system, favoring prisoners and denying indigenous Burunese men a sense of justice that would be often fulfilled through the murder of a prisoner. And although indigenous Burunese women have not had the opportunity to present their perspectives on sexual relations with political prisoners through written sources, we should not write off their agency as historical actors by concluding that they were mere sexual objects competed over by indigenous men and political prisoners. While we can only read about Burundi's women's experiences through the memoirs of political prisoners and government reports, we can still try to reconstruct their agency. One government report recounts a unit commander moderating a dispute between a Burundi's community and a political prisoner over an unpaid harta. The commandant asks the Burundi's woman, "Why, if you're already married, did you have sex with a political prisoner? Do you really like him that much?" And she replies, "I really like him, sir. The political prisoner knows all sorts of sexual ways. He has sex facing forward while playing with my mouth and breasts." Here we can see the Burundi's woman in question had sex with a political prisoner and took a stance that went against both the expectations of the men of her community as well as the prison administrators. We can tell from the evidence whether the political prisoner or indigenous, or we cannot tell from the evidence whether the political prisoner or the indigenous woman initiated the sexual encounter. But we do know that the indigenous woman preferred it to sex with her husband, and this is also something which she's able to enthusiastically admit in public and recount. Some political prisoners have remarked on the strict rules for sexual behavior in Burundi's society, such as that sexual interactions may not happen indoors, and just other very specific stipulations about how sexual behavior should take place. This woman's answer gives credibility to a claim that a number of political prisoners make in their memoir that Burundi's women sought sexual encounters with Javanese political prisoners as much as the political prisoners sought these sexual relationships. Many women often derive greater pleasure from these relationships and exercise greater sexual agency than with their husbands, and also came to see them as novel and exotic. We also see that while many political prisoners exoticized and sexually objectified Burundi's women, the same can be said in reverse. This, along with the openness which Burundi's could express their sexual desires even publicly, must have contributed to a feeling of emasculation among Burundi's men that came to be blamed upon political prisoners. While men had exercised a great degree of control over women in Burundi's society despite the tolerance of pre- and extramarital sex, the degree of deviance, along with the volume of unpaid harta and that had increased with the appearance of the penal colony, no doubt contributed to Burundi's men's sense of emasculation. Towards the latter part of the 1970s, Burundi's clans in the vicinity of the penal settlement were divided over what stance to take toward the political prisoners, cooperation or violent opposition. Women, especially those who had come to know some of the political prisoners intimately, were no doubt a strong voice in these debates. Ultimately, violence against the political prisoners was the exception rather than the norm, and indigenous Burundi's society pivoted toward the Indonesian national community and away from the clan. Sexual relationships on Buru constituted a field of contestation over the bodies of indigenous Burundi's and political prisoners. Prison personnel as well engaged in relationships with indigenous Burundi's and local Buginese women as well, as Pramudia, perhaps Indonesia's most famous author and novelist, recounts that the chief, and he was imprisoned on the island, that's why he's writing so much about this. That the chief commandant lived with a number of mistresses. Cultural incongruity and misunderstanding marked these relationships and encounters, exacerbating tensions. In some instances, however, they acted as a conduit for new cultural practices and ideas, and even kinship ties. Increasingly, sexual relationships and encounters between political prisoners and Burundi's women began to erode traditional conceptions of gender relations in indigenous Burundi's society, undermining a key means by which men had exercised power in their society. Religious indoctrination programs, though targeted at political prisoners, also had an impact on indigenous Burundi's who went to the mosques and churches built by the prison units, coming to identify with global religious communities, and the sexual mores they espoused. Thus, while sexual relations between indigenous women and political prisoners constituted a vector of colonialism that expanded Indonesian national hegemony, it also presented a window of sexual agency and even a greater voice in their society. Sexual encounters between political prisoners and indigenous women, alongside the introduction of Javanese notions of domesticity, new global religions and mass media reoriented Burundi's culture towards a hegemonic one, presupposing a monogamous marital relationship and a nuclear family as the basis of social organization. This was a twofold process through which, first, Burmese women's sexual interactions with Javanese men undermined and devalued the sexual norms of Burmese society, thus undermining the power of traditional male elites, and integrated women into new systems of kinship and domesticity through marriage with Javanese political prisoners. And second, indigenous Burmese came to see hegemonic discourses of the family and domesticity as the ideal norm. Thus, through Muslim and Christian religious communities, neighboring families in Savannah Jaya, and media images conveyed through radio and television, indigenous Burmese came to see themselves as part of a wider Indonesian national imaginary, centered in Jakarta rather than a localized social imaginary mediated by clan heads, shamans, and the ancestral spirits that manifested themselves in the green forest, blue sky, and red earth that once took precedence in matters of everyday life. Sexual relations between indigenous women and political prisoners undoubtedly played a key role as an intimate side of colonialism, one which often goes unexamined. At the same time, it provided new opportunities for indigenous women to exercise sexual and political agency in a society that had long been dominated by men. And here's another picture, which, I don't know, bonus picture? Thank you.